This summer we started with Abraham and Sarah, who laughed at the idea that a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman would have a child. Well, they named that child Isaac. Then Isaac married Rebekah, and after they also tried for decades, she finally became pregnant and gave birth to twins named Jacob and Esau. But in a sign of what was to come, the twins put up a terrible battle inside Rebekah's womb. And when they came down the birth canal, Jacob grabbed the heel of his twin and never stopped trying to get ahead of his older brother, and used every means of trickery and deception he could think of. And among those stories told, Jacob sold Esau some stew for the price of his birthright. And later, Jacob dressed himself in Esau's clothes and covered his neck and his arms with goatskin in order to trick their blind father Isaac, while he was laying on his deathbed, into giving Jacob power over the tribe. And he was helped by his co-conspirator mother, who cooked goat to taste like venison. You've been hearing these stories through the summer, and if you haven't, they're in sermons from the past weeks. So when Esau learned he'd been tricked again, he was so angry, enraged, he vowed to kill his brother. Their mother sent the favorite son off to live with her brother, Laban. So as Jacob ran for his life, the first night he was so exhausted that he slept with a rock for his pillow and dreamt of messengers, like God's angelic office workers going up and down to heaven. It's where we get the familiar image of Jacob's ladder. And so then he finally made it to Uncle Laban's and began working for him and fell in love with Laban's daughter Rachel. Now, Uncle Laban promised Jacob could marry Rachel if he worked for free for 7 years. And Jacob agreed, and 7 years later, he indeed married Laban's daughter, except that in the morning after the marriage had already been consummated, he woke up and discovered he had just slept with Rachel's sister, Leah. Uncle Laban had tricked Jacob into marrying his oldest daughter, but promised that Jacob could marry Rachel if he worked again for another 7 years for free. This trickster had met his match, although to add to this soap opera drama, Jacob also began to scheme to steal his uncle's sheep. So after 20 years of this dysfunctional family dynamic, Jacob felt God was calling him to reunite with his estranged twin brother. And it was a frightful idea because you'll remember their last interaction had involved Esau's raging vow to kill Jacob. But the time had come. Jacob, however, didn't tell Uncle Laban he was leaving. He just took off with his wives and his possessions, his 11 children and livestock, plus some of Laban's possessions. Those ill-gotten sheep, and Rachel added to the fun by stealing her father's household gods. When Laban came back home and discovered this, he raced after their caravan and demanded what had been stolen. He searched through everything, but Rachel sat on those gods and declared it was her time of the month, so she couldn't be searched. And Laban went home infuriated, while Jacob's caravan slowly moved toward this uncertain reunion. So I wanted to remind us of this backstory, because this is all part of what Jacob is now wrestling with. But this time it wasn't a dream on a rock pillow. This time it was so real, he walked away from it limping from a torn muscle. But before I talk more about this wrestling match, I want to finish the story of Jacob and Esau, because next week the lectionary skips on to one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, the one with the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But it just leaves us wondering, so what happened to this dysfunctional family, especially Jacob and Esau? And so for 20 years, Jacob had fretted over what might happen if and when he saw his twin brother again. God told him it was time. But Jacob didn't want to just show up unannounced, so he sent some messengers ahead to prepare his brother. And they were to announce to him, "This is a message from your servant Jacob." Servant? Not brother who tricked and deceived and stole from you? As though we'd want to bring that up. He said, "I've lived as an immigrant with Laban, where I've stayed until now. I own donkeys and cattle and flocks and men and women servants. And I'm sending this message to my master now to ask that he be kind." Master? He is really laying it on thick as he begs for mercy. So the messengers went, gave this message, and they came back with a message from Esau that said, "Esau is coming to meet you with 400 men." Hearing that terrified Jacob. He prayed to God, "You're the one who told me to do this, so you better protect me. Save me from my brother." So Jacob came up with a strategy. He divided everyone and everything into 2 camps, and he thought if Esau meets the first camp and attacks it, at least one camp will be left to escape. And then he pulled aside 200 female goats and 20 male goats. And he sent a servant ahead and told him, "When Esau asks, 'Who are you?' tell him, 'These are a gift from your servant Jacob.' Also tell him, 'Jacob's right behind me.'" And then an hour later, he sent a group of 200 lambs and 20 rams with the same message. "They're a gift from Jacob. He's right behind." And an hour later, he sent 30 nursing camels with their young, same message. An hour later, he sent 40 cows and 10 bulls. And an hour later, he sent 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys, every time the same message. Because Jacob thought he could pacify Esau and overwhelm him with this one generous gift after the other. Quite the contrast to all the things Jacob had stolen from Esau. That's when Jacob went back across the river and spent the night alone. See where this context comes back to. As it turned out, however, he wasn't alone. And he spent a night wrestling with, was it angels? Or demons? Or God? Was he wrestling with his conscience? Or maybe his fears? All of the above? I mean, think of all the baggage he was carrying. In the morning, after this encounter, he limped across the river and rejoined his family on the other side. And his fears were confirmed when in the distance he could see Esau coming closer with 400 men. Oh, his plans hadn't worked. So Jacob then frantically took all his women servants and their children and put them together in a group out front. And behind them, Leah and her children, and behind them, Rachel with Joseph, and behind them, Jacob. And then he came out from behind them and approached Esau, bowing to the ground 7 times. When Esau first spotted Jacob coming from behind these groups of women and children, the big, hairy brute began running, but not with his fists ready to punch, but his arms wide open. Esau hadn't sent an army of 400 to harm Jacob. He had sent a great big welcoming party. And Esau threw his arms around Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they wept. And then he asked to meet his sisters-in-law and his nieces and nephews. And then he asked, "What's with all the gifts you sent? I don't need any of that. Take them back." This is a consummate story of grace and generosity of spirit that reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. You know, we may agree the father had every right to demand a full accounting of what his wasteful son had done with his inheritance. The father had every right to be angry and skeptical that his son would have finally come to his senses. But he wasn't angry, was he? And he told his oldest son, who was angry, "I'm just happy to be reunited. I thought my son was dead, and he's alive." So Esau, too, could have recited this litany of all the ways his brother had tricked him and deceived him, but instead he was grateful to be reunited with his twin. So to finish their story, the brothers had so many livestock and family members. They were so rich and blessed that they had to part ways because they didn't have enough room for all of their possessions. So they went and lived in different lands. But for the first time in their lives, after all they had gone through, they were at peace with one another. And that must have been quite a relief to their father, who was still alive. Remember, he was supposed to be on his deathbed 20 years before, when Isaac tricked him out of giving his blessing to Esau, who was his favorite son. But Isaac didn't die until he was 180 years old, at a time when his sons were at peace. This is one of those old details that go, oh yeah, right, this didn't actually happen. He wasn't actually 180 years old. This is a story. It's an important story. So I'm almost out of time before I've even talked about Jacob's wrestling in the night. But again, I love these stories, and I think the stories need to be told in their fullness. And there's still a couple of things I want to make sure you understand. And so to be clear, Jacob and Israel, they're the same person, right? Got that? When you hear about the 12 tribes of Israel, it's the same as saying the 12 sons of Jacob. Those can get confusing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. And this night of wrestling, it marks that transition between Jacob, who was named for grabbing his brother's heel as they were born, to Israel, which means one who strives or wrestles or struggles with God. This is a very important story because it teaches that to be the people of God is not to be the puppets of a grand marionette. That's not who our God is. We are to be a people who push and pull and argue with God and accuse God of being unfaithful, and yet know that it is to this God we belong. And like any relationship, love is sometimes expressed in affection and sometimes in anger. But it remains love. Genesis 32 is this profoundly mysterious story that raises numerous unanswerable questions. Like, who is this being with whom Jacob wrestles? Or we might ask, with whom or what are you wrestling today? What in the world prompts this nighttime battle? Well, you might be able to relate, because aren't there times when we lay in bed at night wrestling with a question we can't get out of our head? A worry? My other question is, why is Jacob injured? What's that about? But then you have to remember, why we often will ask, why can't we be spared pain? Corinne Cavallo defines faith as the stubborn refusal to let God off the hook. The stubborn refusal to let God off the hook. Wrestling. And an adult faith welcomes that struggle. Answers to ultimate questions don't come neatly packaged. And in fact, answers aren't the point. Meaning doesn't come from having the answer. Meaning comes from this struggle to understand. It changes us. It transforms us. It even renames us, like it changed Jacob into Israel. So, what are you wrestling with today? Angels? Demons? God? Maybe it's your conscience or your fears. Well, hold on. Persist. And remember, when you demand an easy answer, it's a blessing that God invites us to wrestle and not to have to be a puppet. Amen.